Hi, I'm Tony.
I'm Patrick.
We'd like to welcome you to Cave to the Cross Apologetics. We are continuing our discussion on Nancy Pearcey's book, Finding Truth. And we have worked our way partway through the first chapter. And so now we're going to continue finishing up that chapter today and see where she leads us with this particular chapter. This chapter has to do with finding the idol in the other worldview, right, is what she's trying to help us to work through.
Yes.
So, yeah. So the first one here, where we left off, I believe we had just finished talking about, is there, what's the commonality with regard to religions? And basically, most of the things that we think are common, she suggests are not really common. But what is common is what she calls the divine. That is what they take as ultimate reality.
Right. Yep.
And so every religion, and then, of course, every worldview has an ultimate reality. And so you get the conclusion then that every worldview is basically religious.
Right. Every philosophy can be considered a religion. And she went through a study of religion doesn't mean God, because when we think of other religions, there's not necessarily
Buddhism, for instance,
a Godhead.
Yeah.
And then divinity is just a word to mean the self-existent eternal reality that is the origin of everything else. And that's pretty much what everyone has. In fact, not pretty much, that is what everyone has. There is something that ties everything together, and divine is a common parlance to kind of classify that. So we are looking now at individual worldviews, kind of divine, their ultimate. And we start with the primordial ooze. We go back to Western philosophy, which is kind of the cradle of philosophical civilization, and
at least for the West.
Right. Yep. The pre-Socratic, they ignored the Olympian gods and went back to primordial substances, or arche.
Arche, I think.
Oh, there we go. That sounds way more intelligent. Which are pretty much water, fire, air, and earth. And if you add in heart, then you get Captain Planet. So, but what they said is that there's some more basic element. They're able to reduce even all these four things to a single element to arrive at a fundamental unity, which is what physicists have been trying to do for a while now with the different type of elements, with gravity and get to graviton. They're trying to find this kind of unified field theory that Einstein...
Basically the forces, right? The strong force, the weak force, the electromagnetic force, and so on.
Einstein seemed to not really work with it, but some people think that he did, and there's been an attempt within relativity to find that single unified field theory. And so what they did is, for some, the divine substance was air, and others went beyond the four elements. Pythagoras discovered the order of nature can be represented by geometry and mathematics. If you get in the study of Pythagoras, the Pythagorean theorem, there seems to be some order, some interesting order when you study kind of Pythagoras and the work that he did, and the kind of the stuff that Newton would go on to discover too has a lot of interesting quirks. As it's interesting that math seems to kind of unfold from itself, almost like there's a design to it. So he went on. Pythagoras said that God is number, number is God. This attempt to kind of distill everything down to the answer 42. And Scripture, however, asserts that all things hold together in Christ. So it's this comparing and contrasting. So where we find our commonality, everything is pinpointed to Christ, as what any Christian would say. Here the Greek pre-Socratics also tried to find this distilled down into a single point for them. So you have Plato and Aristotle, the rational forms. If you took a kind of intro to philosophy, you hit this: abstract concepts that make it possible to categorize the world. Out of all the dogs or cats, what makes them dog-like or cat-like or
dogness? Of course,
right? Yeah,
catness. Yeah.
If you cut off the tail, then which part is the cat? Well, it's the form of the cat. Plato went on to say that these forms exist in ideal realms separate from matter, forms as eternal, uncreated, unchangeable, universal, and self-existing. Sounds like a definition really close to
ultimate reality.
Ultimate reality, yeah.
And the divine.
Yeah. Is this a divine claim? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Human nature is the form shared by all human beings. What makes us all human is that we all are human-like, I guess. Justice is the form shared by all just actions, and it is what makes them just. Forms are the ultimate explainer to them. Speaking of forms, Aristotle, here we must be the divine, and this must be the first and most dominant principle. For Plato, the preeminent form is the form of the good. To see good involves a conversion, a turning of the soul from darkness to light. True philosopher is the person who contemplates this divine order. So sounds less philosophical and more theological, if you had to put this in another context. In Romans 1, however, we learn that idols result from divinizing something immanent within the cosmic order.
Right.
That description certainly applies to these forms that Plato enjoyed. They are not personal. Although they transcend the material world, they do not transcend the cosmic order as a whole. They seem to exist in nature. So we can't get to an absolute, ultimate, something that is outside of the order it's within it. In a Christian sense, Plato's form of good is not divine. It's divine because it is the highest being in the cosmos.
So the good is what he considered as the highest.
The capital good, Aristotle even defined God as pure form. So if you take a intro to philosophy class, this is kind of the God is the ultimate of ultimates. So he's the ultimate form.
Prime mover, where everything started from, that kind of stuff for Aristotle.
Right. Yeah. So that's all the kind of Greek folks, what they viewed as either forms or elements. They all tried to distill down into one thing, one being, and then from there derive out, which we still continue to try and do. Yeah. And it's what everyone does. So that's what Nancy Pearcey is doing in this portion of the book.
Yeah, good. So she then asked us, well, what about modern philosophies, right? What do they do in terms of this coming up with the idol and ultimate reality? And she says, yes, they do the same thing. The prevailing view among the new atheists, among which much of the academic world, is scientific materialism, right? What is ultimately real is matter, molecules in motion. And so materialism is committed to the dogma that physics explains all of chemistry, chemistry explains all of biology, and biology explains the human mind, with nothing left over. Even the mind. Human mind is explained in terms of physical things, right? Now, of course, materialism is also called physicalism. Right? Again, it's the same idea that everything is the physical universe is all that there is.
Right.
That's what everything is made up of.
Yeah, your personality are synopsis firing off. You're a collection of your memories that are just a bag of goo that's sliding around in your head, and you get brain damage, and there goes part of your personality. That's not your. There's no ultimate transcendent person in you. Right. That's just
non-material.
Molecules that have motioned in a different way. Then.
Right. And so is this view religious? Of course it is, right? She quotes John Searle. There is a sense in which materialism is the religion of our time. End quote. Right. So yes, this view is of course religious. Another writer says, quote, "I believe a material explanation will be found, but that confidence comes from, notice this, my faith that science is up to the task of explaining in purely material or naturalistic terms the whole history of life, end quote. So, he concludes, my faith is well-founded, but it's still a faith, right? It's a faith that science, in terms of materialistic views and materialistic explanations, will be able to find this, this whole, what the life is all about.
Yeah,
right?
and if you want to take faith and throw it out there, then, okay, he's confident. Well, confidence is where we derive the term faith from. So that's pretty much all it is. So when you say, do you believe that your spouse is faithful? Do you have confidence in your spouse is what you're saying.
So you're using that word in the same way, right? And she quotes Carl Sagan, that famous quote from the Cosmos, right? The cosmos is all there is, or ever was, or ever will be. Clearly, that's a statement of materialism or physicalism, right? Mm-hmm. So that's it. That's the ultimate reality. Carl Sagan was suggesting. She also quotes Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? He Tyson sometimes called his followers sometimes call his position Tysonism, right? It's defined as a secular religion based on the philosophy of Dr. Tyson, right? The page lists under the category church religious organization, Tysonism is listed in this particular book. So, materialism is the idol, the ultimate reality that is much enforced during our time. Now, she says it's really a cluster, it's a family of related philosophies, right? For example, when we apply materialism or physicalism to the economic realm, materialism gives rise to theories like Marxism, right? So that's just a materialistic theory that's applied to the economic realm. Right.
Even within Marxism, you have the idea that it is humanity at its base concept good, predominantly good. Yeah. And they say yes. Yeah. So it makes a moral claim within itself. And obviously, you're going to have those people that say, no, my Marxist view is, Lenin-Stalinist, it's anarcho-communist. So there are different forms of it, but for the most part, when it comes to human explanation, there is still a moral claim, and then from there it derives from these materialistic principles.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and in fact, she kind of lays out here how Marxists, in terms of materialism, gets us to this particular end. Right? She says, what are the logical steps that led from materialism to Marxism? With its economic determinism, she says, well, bear in mind that human nature is always defined by its relationship to ultimate reality. So, our relationship to ultimate reality, that's how we define humans, right? So if the ultimate is matter, then humans are defined by the way that they relate to matter. And how do people relate to matter? Well, they make things out of it, right? They manipulate it, that kind of stuff. They mold and manipulate and manufacture items that they need, clothes, houses, tables, and that sort of thing. And so in Marxism, the tools we use to shape matter are called the means of production, right? So that's where she's going. Thus, she says the history of civilization hinges on who owns the means of production. And so in a Marxist economic conditions, the idea, the economic conditions for Marxists then become the ultimate explainer of what's going on. Yeah. And so it gets us to that same type of deal.
Yeah, and obviously we're covering these very briefly in an overview. Right. But a lot of this, a lot of good work could come from just analyzing Marxism from that point and drilling down from its divinity and then working up to where it lies for explaining the world, explaining how we got here, and explaining kind of human behavior. And so I'm sure people have done that, and those resources are out there. But it's really interesting that we can do this. So another one is empiricism. It's an only valid form of knowledge consists of empirical verified facts. So we tend to get this in our everyday life. We rely ultimately on empirical facts, what we see, feel, weigh, measure, only what we can kind of feel out with our senses is what's real. So there's no supernatural, there's no mind, there's a brain because that you can touch and measure, firing off of synapses. That's your only thought. There's nothing that transcends outside of kind of those five senses and the relation to them. As a result, empiricism does not consider concepts to be truths at all, but merely individual values and preferences, those things that are moral or theological concepts. And so a big proponent of this is our good friend David Hume, who we can't seem to get away from. He declared that if a book contains anything beyond empirical science, it ought to be burned, which to me sounds like a moral claim, but hey, whatever. Is this another idol? Certainly, empiricism makes an idol of the sensory realm. It's the ultimate explainer. It drills down to your sense, and really your sense, not even anybody else's. But that's the way we can know the world. A few years ago, a survey of philosophers at leading university asked which non-living philosopher would they most identified with, and we learned this from our last book as well. David Hume was the big guy. Right. Philosophy spill out from classrooms into popular culture, and there's a nice little Star Trek one here, and I could really go in a lot to this, and I would love to do a podcast on all the philosophy of Star Trek one day, but I'll skip that. And she goes in here to kind of show how even within pop culture, empiricism seems to be a big have big proponents. So if you ask Christians for empirical evidence that Jesus was Messiah, they'd probably list historical evidences of the resurrection, factual evidence for the claims of the New Testament, manuscript evidence for the reliability of the biblical text, archaeological evidence for the events in Scripture, and so on. The Christian message rests on events and can be seen, heard, and touched. So we're not outside of saying
we don't disagree important. That there's that empiricism is important, and helps us in terms of gaining knowledge. Sure, right?
It's one of those means by which we gain knowledge. And when we get into the second part, if we were to deny this, we would actually be facing an idol as well, because we wouldn't be. We would be reducing humanity incorrectly. And so no matter how strong the evidence, any claim that there exists something beyond what is known by empirical science is attacked as irrational. And that's true.
So basically, we're saying it's just not the whole story. Right. And these philosophers and philosophies tend to try to make it the whole story. Right. Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah. So then we move. So what happens? She says, if what is real is defined in terms of what can be known by the five senses, then reality seems to include only the material world, right? Because that's all that we can experience by our five senses. But if you track empiricism, she says, to its logical conclusion, it takes a surprising turn inward, right, towards the mind, right? This signals an important trend in Western thought from materialism to mentalism, right? And so she tells us, think of it this way. Empiricism says that the only source of genuine knowledge is sense impressions, all right? So just what we can experience by our senses, right? Sight, sounds, and so forth. But how do we know whether our sense impressions are true and accurate? Right? I mean, it's not like we can step outside of our mind, right, or our head and check the world against our sense impressions. We can't do that. So how do we know, right? And they can fool us, right? Sure. You put a spoon in a glass of water and it looks bent, right? And so
train tracks meet at a point all the time.
Yeah, right? So how do we test our sense experience? She says the answer is that for the strict empiricist, we can't test them. Right? And so it's impossible to step out of our mind, as I mentioned, and try to make these tests. And so empiricist philosophers themselves recognize then that this is a problem. What's the problem? They're stuck in their minds. Right? That's as far as they can go, right? According to empiricism, our mind constructs the concepts of a table out of a cluster of sensations, but we cannot step outside of our minds to discover what the eternal world is like in itself. We're kind of stuck in our minds, right? And yeah. She quotes Morpheus in the Matrix, which is another movie that we could probably spend a lot of time on.
Yeah. Oh man, if it wasn't for the Matrix, would philosophy be where it's at today?
Yeah. So he says, "How do you define reality?" Right? Remember that?
Yeah, of course.
So if you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
Do you think that's air you're breathing?
Yeah. So Hume seems to have, accepted this bizarre conclusion, she tells us, right? He wrote, "Let us chase our imaginations to the heavens or to the utmost limits of the universe. We never really advance a step beyond ourselves. We live in the universe of the imagination." So there we are. We're stuck in it, and even Hume realized it, right? And so the upshot, she says, is that if we begin solely with sense impressions, then we will end with sense impressions, right? And so using sensory experience alone, there's no way to build a bridge from the internal mental images to the external world. We're trapped in the prison house of our minds. Wow, that's pretty scary.
Yeah, right. The whole brain in the vat, or you don't really ever think of yourself as a brain inside your head, inside the body. You're not praying from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles being carried along by his body. So there seems like there's an issue there. Mm-hmm. And then the kind of competing rival to empiricism is rationalism.
Right.
But again, we're trapped inside our mind with rationalism, because rationalism claims the sole source and standard of knowledge are ideas in the mind known by reason. Mm-hmm. So by reason. So it's impossible to step outside our reasons, of course, again, to test those ideas as being accurate. Like empiricism,
so the same problem.
It lacks a way to bridge the gap from the internal ideas to the external world. Right. Does the steak in the Matrix taste like steak because that's what steak tastes like, or is that what the molecules are telling you? So
the electrochemical processes
it's just how do I know your steak tastes like my steak?
I think they use chicken though.
They do use chicken. Yes. They go on to say that philosophers began to search for some deeper source of truth, not in any of the theological authorities, of course, or some sacred books, and certainly not in some civic institutions engaged in armed warfare with one another. In fact, not in any external source at all. Their hope was to find a method located solely within the individual, rooted in the immediate data of the consciousness. Mm-hmm. And the founder of empiricism was Francis Bacon. And he outlined a program designed to purge our minds of all the popular notions picked up from our education and environment to begin anew from the very foundations, which good luck with that. Yeah. Man. Forget about everything that you know about,
everything.
Yeah, pillows.
Yeah.
Okay, go. What were the foundations? In his view, the simplest, most direct form of knowledge were sense perceptions, sights and sounds. He proposed to rebuild knowledge on the foundation of sensations. Founder of rationalism was Descartes. And Descartes' kind of on our side. He was a Christian, or at least a person who believed in God, and he went into a cabin for 3 days, and after 3 days, he kind of started the new modern age, which I do have to say is pretty impressive, no matter who you are. He proposed this idea to purge our minds of every fuzzy and half-baked idea, everything that could possibly be doubted, till we reach a foundation that cannot be doubted.
Doubt everything until we get to the bottom line, right? Yeah.
Even if all my ideas were delusions, he argued, there is still a self who is experiencing those delusions. This is the meaning of his famous phrase, I think, therefore I am. Yeah. He hoped that the clear and distinct ideas in the mind would be the ultimate foundation to which we build knowledge. And, of course, there are a lot of people who have even attacked I and think and I again and am. So he tried to distill
Some people
down.
say that he kind of got the cart before the horse, right? It's I am before I think.
Right. The Descartes before the horse.
That's right.
Both Bacon and Descartes expressed some level of Christian conviction. Nevertheless, philosophies they proposed did not treat God as the final source of truth. Instead, they replaced God with the individual consciousness. Again, that's especially what Descartes did. He was trying to reason up to God from the individual, and Nancy Pearcey is trying to point to the fact that the direction was going the wrong way. We seem to need to have this postulation that God is the ultimate authority, and from there we get the I am. As philosophers say, that they turn to first-person standpoint into the path to certainty. Thus, it would be immune to any external criticism and challenge. Like the foundation of a house, it would provide a solid, infallible foundation to build the edifice of knowledge.
Yeah.
And it, like I said, it helped usher in the kind of modern worldview, and I think most debates from a religious standpoint or within the scientific realm all have this attempt to trying to say, is it true to me? Then, and then can I convince you? And then can I convince everybody else? I think that's kind of where our modern debate practice kind of comes from. Too.
Yeah. And so she tells us that clearly Enlightenment thinkers, like these folks that we've been talking about, were seeking a God substitute. Just as Romans 1 says, they fastened on something within creation to serve in the place of God as their secure and certain source of truth, right? The ultimate explainer kind of thing, the fixed foundation of knowledge, right? That's what Descartes was after. That's what all these folks were after, right? Bacon's empiricism appealed to the authority of the senses. Descartes' rationalism appealed to the authority of the intellect, right? So you get down to this thing. So in the end, she says, ironically, the search for godlike knowledge was restricted to the tiny universe of the self, because they all end, at least these two, in trapping us in our minds, right? Most philosophers, she says, and most philosophies are born with when someone stumbles on one of the undeniable facts of human experience and then claims to have discovered the ultimate, right? This is the ultimate and infallible foundation of all knowledge. And so Bacon recognized that in practice, no one can deny the testimony of the senses. We cannot function in the world unless we trust the basic reality of the senses. And so that must be the deal, right? For Bacon, that was the deal. For Descartes, he stumbled upon another undeniable experience, our sense of self or personal existence. Even if we can be induced to doubt everything, right? He argued there's still a self that is doing the doubting. So rationalism takes this fact of experience and absolutizes it, she tells us, seeking to build a full-blown philosophy on it. But if you begin with ideas in the mind, right, that is where you will end. You're trapped. Right? You'll be trapped in the prison house of your mind. And so every non-biblical philosophy, she tells us, fastens on something in creation to become its idol, right? Something known by general revelation, and then tries to build a system of truth off that foundation. So our experience of the created world are merely, though, data that need to be explained. They are signposts of God, of a transcendent creator, not the deal in itself, the ultimate, reality. And so that's where these folks missed it. We misread, she says, the sign if we treat them as sources of ultimate truth in themselves. Invariably, they turn into dead ends when we try to do that with them, right? Yeah.
Well, it just seems that empiricism and rationalism has it all wrong. We're all trapped in our mind. Clearly, the next step is to just deny the external world.
Just wipe it out.
Yeah.
Right.
So what I see, what I perceive, what I think about the ball falling off the cliff, that's just gobbledygook. That doesn't even exist. Instead, though, my mind creates the world.
There you go.
Yeah, and so of course this is our good friend Immanuel Kant, and you kind of get into, I guess, metaphysics classes if you want to look into this, or philosophy of science.
Epistemology, right? Yeah.
His innovation was to suggest that the mind does not merely reflect the structure of the world. Instead, it actively imposes structure on the world and order. For Kant, reality as we know it is largely constructed of the human mind. So I always get these mixed up. So it's I don't perceive, or I'm not. There's no table here, but what I'm doing is I'm perceiving things that I would call a table.
Yeah. So and it's kind of really abstract, right? So, for instance, abstract ideas like causality. we impose causality on the world. The world isn't cause and effect, that we do that with our minds. So it's really he has these 12 categories that he works through. And he says that those are the things that we're equipped with, they're innate within us, and we kind of impose them on the mind. So that's the kind of thing. They're really abstract types of things. Yeah.
So according to Kant, the raw material of knowledge are sense impressions flooding in the mind through our eyes and ears to a jumbled chaos. And how do those perceptions get organized in a coherent and tangible whole? By the creative action of the human mind. So we're kind of the creators in a sense. Kant proposed that the mind supplies the necessary ordering principles such as the before and after, the cause and effect, space, time, and so on. The world appears to be a lawful ordered only because the human mind creates that order. Well, good. We know where it all came from.
Right.
In Kant's world, mind is the lawgiver to nature. Does this sound like a idol? Well, pretty
Absolutely.
clear.
Yeah.
Kant has moved the human consciousness to the center of reality. So it's not just the mind, the human consciousness. The primary reality is not matter, but mind. He said that the world of objects is largely given its shape and character by human consciousness. As philosopher Alvin Plantinga, our good friend, we
saw that earlier.
That Mitch Stokes studied under,
Right.
explains the fundamental thrust of Kant's Copernican revolution is that things in the world owe their fundamental structure and perhaps their very existence to the noetic activity of our minds. And if the mind imposes even the categories of space and time, then it itself must be outside of time.
Right.
Time. Kant called this timeless, changeless mind the transcendental ego. The philosophical label for this view is idealism. The term is not used in the ordinary sense of having high ideals as we kind of come to know it, but that there's an ultimate reality is the realm of ideas, the mental realm. Instead of deifying matter, idealism deifies the mind. And conscious structures matter as we know it. It makes consciousness the ultimate explainer. So again, the thing that Kant puts in place as an idol is not just humanity, but the human mind.
Right. Yeah. So we impose all these, space, time, causality, all that stuff is imposed on the world by our mind.
Yeah, that's your supernatural phenomenon to Kant. The textbook often said that Kant's philosophy combined empiricism and rationalism. However, on its own premise, there's no way to step outside the human mind and test whether ideas match external reality. The logical consequence is solipsism. So if anyone's asked the question of, do you believe that there are other minds out there, you could never know. You only know yours.
Right.
The only thing I can know for sure is the existence of my own mind. No direct knowledge of anything but its own contents.
Yeah.
So, good luck.
Yeah.
we're still trapped in us.
Yeah, so it leaves us trapped, right?
Yeah.
And so she says that despite the flaws in idealism, it was enthusiastically embraced by the Romantic movement, right? Many Romantics were artists, and they were attracted to idealism because it deified the mind over and the creative imagination, right? So if the mind is the power that imposes order on the world, creating order from chaos, then the artist is no longer just an artisan, but a creator.
That sounds very artistic. Yeah.
So for the romanticists, then, the ultimate foundation for truth was neither the senses, empiricism, nor reason, rationalism, but creative imagination, right? So that became then the ultimate for the Romantics, right? The Romantics were claiming that the imagination generates ultimate truth. There it is, right there, right? And so that's the source of it, and so Romanticism then was kind of born out of Kant's idealism. Right, and so that's where it came from, and it leads, and she will talk about this later. It leads really to the modern, postmodern movement that we see. That we saw, especially in the late 20th century.
Yeah, even within the art world had its own, like Cubism and the kind of abstract art, or taking the idea that it's not the artist that define meaning, but the art is placed out there, and each person gives its own meaning. A lot of those ideas flow from this romanticism.
Right. Because each mind does its thing to the world.
Right. Yeah. And I'm the only mind, so good luck with that. So what can we do? All right. Well, luckily we have Romans 1.
Yeah.
And Romans 1 that gives Christians the ability to identify the idol. Each one carves out some aspect of creation and elevates it to false absolutes. This is what we've gone over, a single, all-defining principle. This tendency to absolutize some part of creation is the source of all the isms. Writer and Christian philosopher Dewey Weird says. One part of the created order is treated as the whole. One piece of the puzzle is claimed to be the complete picture.
Right. So you grab a hold of one piece and you say that's what everything is like. So it's either empiricism or rationalism or the imagination of the mind or whatever. And then you kind of run with it.
That's all there is. And that's the main factor. And people write books on that and have followings. So we kind of went over the kind of blind men and the elephant. This is the same way. And so we said that it's the person writing the story that can kind of give us the complete picture and say, look at these blind men trying to see the elephant as this whole.
The elephant, what's the elephant like? Yeah. Well, he's only touching the tail, so the elephant is like a rope, right? So the same idea here. They take one piece of reality and then kind of make that the whole. Right. Is the idea, yeah.
And for Christianity, though, however, it doesn't start with anything in creation. It begins with the transcendent creator. Therefore, it is not limited in scope. It does not have to reduce all of reality to a single set of categories. It does not see the trunk as just the tusk or the tail or the side of the elephant. It is a transcendent point of view that sees the whole elephant, the God's eye view that philosophers and mystics have always sought. So we're not trapped inside of our own minds. We're able to make sense of the world. We're able to be able to do science and reason and logic and be creative. We're able to do all these kind of things that even to do economic viewpoints because of what a transcendent God creator does.
All right. Well, so here's the issue then. So we throw all these things out because they're no good? Well, of course not, right? She says the philosophies that we've been learning in this book form the backbone of all of Western thought. The ideas that inform every subject area, every academic discipline, every profession. So, and she says, other subjects areas draw from this same well. But we don't need to throw them out, right? She says that students have sometimes told her that the main message they get from reading books on apologetic is everyone else is wrong, right? But she says as Romans 1 approach offers a refreshing alternative because a counterfeit God is something within creation. It leads people to focus on that aspect of creation, which means that they are likely to uncover some genuine truths, right? Because it is something that is in creation, right? And so she says, she goes over some of these various isms, right? Some of these various idols, and she says that there's truth in some of them, right? I mean, in all of them, actually. Materialism, she says, is partly right because God did create a material universe, right? In fact, not only that, but he pronounced that it was good, right? So materialism at least has that, there's something good in there. Rationalism gets something right because God did create the world with a rationally knowable structure, right? So there's no problem. Empiricism gets some things right because God did create a world with a sensory dimension, right? And he equipped us with the five senses to function in this world so that we could carry out the commands with regard to the world that he gave us, right? Romanticism was right to oppose the Enlightenment worldviews that reduce humans to complex machines, and it was right to assert human freedom and creativity because we are made in the image of God, and Christians should be more committed than anyone else to supporting the creative arts, is what she says, right? So a biblical worldview enables Christians to approach every viewpoint with a free and respectable attitude, knowing that virtually every perspective offers something of value.
Right. Yeah. It's one of the reasons why, as a presuppositionalist, you tend to most likely hear, well, how do you justify that? Right. Like, yes, you can do science. Yes, you can be rational. Yes, you can be moral. Even people who are not Christian can do all those things and be all those things. But what grounding, what justification do you have for that? So that's it. So we're taking the puzzle box and we're putting all the pieces in and
instead of just taking out one piece and saying this is the whole puzzle, right?
And that's what 2 and 3 and 4 and the 5th principle does.
Yeah.
So in every age, Christians face the task of identifying what is good and true in the surrounding culture. The Christian church was born in the intellectual climate shaped by Greek philosophy. The challenge for the church fathers was to design a strategy for addressing that highly literate but pagan culture, stifling thoughts and prevailing ideas they found much more than they had to reject as contrary to the Bible. And she goes on to say that the church fathers also passed on a phrase they borrowed from the Old Testament that they kind of like took plunder from the Egyptians. So metaphorically, the phrase came to mean appropriating the best of pagan society, including art and scholarship. Mm-hmm. So can Christians make art? Yes. But how do we make that art follows from biblical principles. The first colleges were born out of Christianity. Mm-hmm. Many of our scientific discoveries, the survival of the fittest, the different scientific methods seem to have stemmed from a belief in ultimate creator rather than in creation in of itself.
Right. So these scientific principles came out of a worldview that said that there was a creator that had these various principles in terms of how the creation worked.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and she goes on to explain a good kind of dialogue here with Paul in Acts 17 on Mars Hill. Very important. I would highly suggest getting this book and going over that because that seems to be a big point for us presuppositionalists on how to kind of approach this kind of don't answer or these 5 principles in practice.
The basic idea here is you kind of enter into their worldview, their perspective, and then based on that, you show them how it, how the limits to it,
mm-hmm.
right? And then you bring them back to Christianity.
Right. And so that's the end of the first one, identifying the idol. And so kind of asking the questions of, okay, where is this person coming from? Do they believe only in the mind, only in the sense perception? Do they believe only in logic? And from there, you've identified the idol, and then step 2 is what we're going to be going into, which is to kind of take a look at what are the missing pieces mm-hmm. that explanation leaves out of humanity.
Yeah.
And so,
good. So this is the idea of, she says that we kind of, there's a reductionism going on
right.
when you just take a piece of it, and therefore it affects how you view humanity. And so that's part of what we'll see in chapter 2.
Right. So join us next time, and we'll hit part 2. And I'll probably be split into 2 episodes as well. And go out and watch some Star Trek and view some empiricism.
Yeah. Or maybe The Matrix.
Yeah, there you go. Thanks.
See you next time.